The mood randomly struck me to play a JRPG. Why not add another massive project to my growing list of time sinks, right? It's not like I have a bevy of other videos to make or anything. Ho ho ho. Well, I used to play quite a few, but in recent years my affinity for the genre has dimmed. And it wasn't even, as it was for a lot of people, because of Final Fantasy XIII. I just started noticing a lot of patterns brewing that didn't really connect with me, and it probably wasn't until Persona 4 Golden that I played any JRPG past 2007 for more than 5 hours. And that includes Persona 3 at that. But the bug hit me, and I wanted to give the genre another shot. Now, let's look at this game. I have two observations about the title. For one, The Legend of Heroes is possibly the dumbest name for a game I have ever heard, right up there with Divine Divinity. But I guess it can be forgiven because this series has been around since 1989, although for the longest time I thought the first game was the 2005 remake on PSP. The second point I want to make is, well, the reason I gravitated towards this game instead of others is because I'm a Max Payne fan.
Gentlemen, we're done here. Take me to Cold Steel.
I'm not even kidding, that's all I can think about when I hear the title to this game. But we know better than to judge things by their covers, otherwise Lightning might have been in 13-2 for more than 5 minutes. You play as Reen Schwarzer, attendee of 4's military academy and student of the newly instated Class 7. The official statement of the class's intended outcome is the testing of this combat apparatus named Arcus, which basically lets you all cast spells and form combat links to further boost your powers. But as you go on field trips to every part of the Erebonian Empire, you'll discover the world is much larger than it first feels, and nothing is quite as it... Wait a second. A diverse class of red-jacketed students in an experimental class in a military academy, their curriculum involving equal parts research from an experimental combat mode and low-key combat operations, uncovering the major political stakes involved. This is just Final Fantasy Type O. It was actually very striking to see how closely linked the two are conceptually. And tactics, apparently this takes after FF Tactics too. Well, now we've narrowed down how this is like Type O, let's narrow down how it's not like Type O. The characters aren't named after a fucking deck of cards. The characterization in Cold Steel is actually rather good, which surprised me for several reasons. One is it's yet another one of those games that just dumps all the characters on you to start off with, and expects you to get everyone's identity within the prologue. If I ever get a TV tropes page, you can go ahead and file this under Berserk button. Another reason is that some of the characters are, archetypal. Reen is okay for reasons I'll get into later, but that everyone's personality subsets can be figured out within one line from each was not inspiring. Hey, this girl who falls on you in a trapdoor is all... what's the word? Sundara?
A tsundere.
Your closest buddy is shy, dislikes combat, and is a healer. The swordswoman of the group is stoic as fuck. And you got two guys who start butting heads and dragging the morale of the class down. Interesting tactic on Nihon Falcom's part though. One of the two is a member of the nobility, the other hates nobles, and the latter is portrayed as the more insensitive party. You can't sway me, Falcom. Good, bad, he's the guy with the gun, but much like Dan Savage's campaign, and unlike Dan Savage himself, it gets better. What the supporting cast lacks in originality and depth, they make up for in clarity and personality. Your classmates don't just have personality traits, they have backstories, they have interests, and some of these are doled out as part of the main story, and some you just kinda stumble upon or have to work towards, depending on how open and confident a particular student is. For example, stumbling upon Elliot in his room will show off his affinity for music, but he's embarrassed and even a little ashamed to admit he would have rather gone to a dedicated school for music if not for his father being a leader of one of the army's tank units. Or take Gaius, the soft-spoken foreigner with a love of painting. When you visit his home in the Nord Highlands... Wait, wouldn't that make it Skyrim? His classmates look at how great his family and life are there and ask why he would ever leave, and he enacts a big speech at how he saw his homeland was threatened to struggle with the possibility of war between two unaffiliated nations because it sits right on the border, and he leaves his home because he wants to find a way to protect it. And when even the snobbish noble agrees it's the single best reason anyone has for joining the class, you know it's actually a really poignant moment. People still use that word, right? Okay, so none of the students are charismatic firebrands, but there's a respectable level of emotional sincerity and organic personal development that gives them a greater sense of connection than first appears. Consider that I, mean old I don't give a fuck about Ace forgetting his dead friend, we'll get to that, can rattle off all of Class 7's names, interests, backgrounds and relations without missing a beat. Cold Steel's gotta be doing something right, but we got more pressing matters. At this point we're still stuck in a dungeon full of monsters and I haven't talked about combat. It starts out as a basic turn-based battle system with spells that need to be charged and character-specific abilities that drain from a separate meter that fills when you hit enemies or are hit yourself, with a layer of locationally minded attack radiuses and movement options on top. The big draw is the combat link system, where hitting an enemy with certain physical attacks or just a critical hit will unbalance them, and let whoever a character is partnered with get a follow-up on them. This evolves to give you all sorts of big group attacks and passive support abilities like automatic guards and counters, but beneath the schoolhouse where the first dungeon is, it amounts to very little. In fact, the first dungeon is pretty bad. Just a slog through a barren drab area with some weak loot and too many questions about why you're there, until you get to the first boss, which is actually a neat wake-up call. One thing I really like is that not every tactic is just given to you. When the boss is priming its big AoE attack, you have to have the know-how to think on your own, oh, I should probably move out of the way. But you also have to think about how your turn order moving forward will affect the bonuses that land on whatever character acts on that particular turn. And you don't want to give the boss a 50% health boost, but you'll want to get physical attacks on critical turns for instant imbalances to stack the damage. And the way I'm talking about this kind of summarizes why I find this combat enjoyable. It has layers, but not in a bewildering way. The entire system is comprised of several subsystems that overlap and influence each other, and while no one turn usually decides a win or loss, there are plenty of possible effects that can go into one turn. Later on into the game, your combat link evolves to give you more types of attack upon imbalance, but they cost bravery points, which you can only get using regular follow-up attacks, so sometimes it's better to try and stockpile points for the rush attacks against stronger enemies later on. There's a similar concept with S-crafts. Super attacks you can pull off by draining all your CP. While you can do this at any point a character has 100 CP, including interrupting enemy turns and getting their turn bonuses, they only become fully potent when you reach the cap of 200 CP. But if a character dies, they lose all their CP and have to struggle to get it back. So going for the best of the best attacks is always a gamble over the long term. Combine that with arts primer times, enemy arts primer times, movement boundaries, turn bonuses and so on, and you have a game where any turn can have an untold number of effects over the long term of both the battle and the mission you're currently on, so there's a great sense of player engagement every step of the way. And although the difficulty doesn't get as hard as it should, at least on normal, the real crux of this game's test is in the experience bonuses it hands out at the end of each fight, forcing you to be really efficient and tactical to reap the best rewards. The only real hang up I have on a mechanical level is the denotation of turn ordering. Although similar to FF10's turn sliders, it doesn't feel as efficient. When throwing in delay inducing attacks, it can just be confusing. Anyway, after beating the first boss and proving their mettle in a slightly unsanctioned test, Class 7 is well and truly underway. In between the first trial underneath the old schoolhouse and the first practical exam of the class is a week where the free day is spent by Reen helping out the student council with odd jobs. I had to use this map to quickly jump around the campus, talking to various students, introducing myself to everyone and spending time with certain classmates to improve their combat link levels at my discretion. And at that point I realised something kind of obvious. This is a Persona game. And at that point I realised something kind of profound. I have played through the latter two Final Fantasy XIII games, and I even really enjoyed 13 too. Lightning Returns was a bigger disrespect of my time than Phantom Pain, but I digress. I think by now you'd have to be completely clueless to not recognise that 13's legacy is that of people hating on Lightning, and citing worst birthday ever as one of the worst cutscenes ever. Final Corridor 13, blah 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 blah. Well, I tend not to throw my hat into the ring on these meta topics, but I always thought a game's greatest legacy Odyssey was that which it left behind in future developers and future projects. And if there's any testament to 13's lack of quality and how it wounded the Final Fantasy name in a way it is yet to truly recover from, it's that I can't think of any other games that tangibly derived elements from it. This relates to Cold Steel because when I saw the words bonding points, I instantly thought of the words social link. That Cold Steel wears this influence on its sleeve is a good argument to Persona 4's enduring popularity, but I can't think of a single other facet of game design that makes me think of the words paradigm shift. And we can argue about the pure tenacity of 13's haters and whether it's all justified, but I personally think that the lack of any follow-ups to its concept or design that wasn't just a direct sequel is the final death knell. I mean, Dark Souls has more lifted concepts these days. Not even Demon Souls, Dark Souls, which not only came out well after 13, but which has an infamously elitist and revolting fanbase. But developers look over that because they recognise what works about Dark Souls, just as they do with Persona. But they don't do that with 13, and I think this matters because it wasn't even that long ago that FF was top dog. I think the reason we all thought that JRPG was dying at the beginning of the 360 era was because they were still parroting the values of Final Fantasy 7 through 10, and we thought even otherwise ambitious projects like Lost Odyssey were regressive wastes of time for it. So if there's any argument for which JRPG is most renowned nowadays, it's a recent chapter in the age-old Legend of Heroes series, just flat out stealing social links. And none of this is even to suggest that influential equals good. I mean, I don't like Gone Home, and I hate Bayonetta, but since we just passed the 6th anniversary of 13's release, and it still gets people's blood pumping no matter where they fall on the game, I think a little wider perspective should put this to rest, because I'm pretty sick of this fucking game either way. Anyway, all that to say that Cold Steel really drives home how we're living in a post-Persona 4 world, but because I plan to divulge for a very long time as to why I love Persona 4, I'm not complaining. The characterization here isn't quite as good, but forcing the player to choose which events to see by limiting their allowed viewings can make for some grueling choices of who to get to know better, depending on where you are in the main story. The explicit mechanical benefit is giving whichever character more combat link experience between them and Reen, unlocking specific bonuses when the two are paired up, but the story-based reasons for picking and choosing who you get closer to are just as appealing. Unfortunately, after you've spent all your points, you have to do your jobs for the student council, and most of these are just inane fetch quests around both the school and the neighbouring town. These are always bookended by visits into the old schoolhouse, which is ever-changing and has a mystery deep inside. Ooh. After that, and a piss-easy combat exam, the game hands you your first field study assignment, and this is more or less the crux of the adventure. Every month, Class 7 is split into 2 groups and sent off to some faraway part of the country, helping out with whatever tasks are given to them by the townsfolk. In doing so, they will hopefully take in the culture of their surroundings and further understand the wider ramifications of whatever troubles they run into, no matter how mundane they might seem. And if there's any place where Cold Steel shines, it's here. Although the tasks given to you mostly boil down to fetch quests, looting and killing monsters in the surrounding area, Class 7 will also come across actions certain parties perform that will seem outwardly unjust, and in their naivete ask why they can get away with it. The first field study leads you to a market town that hosts a big event every year, but it's slowly being eroded by the province's owner wanting to impose a new tax law that the town's governor is reneging on, and as a result the provincial army is slowly but surely coercing the town into enacting these taxes by refusing to solve civil disputes within the town. And when Class 7 stumbles upon one such occurrence of the army being late to the party, they eventually uncover that these 2 merchants who fought each other over store permits were framed for the destruction of each other's property by bandits, which the army hired to try and quicken the binding of the Lord's tax laws. And although the class just barely manages to uncover the truth, the army almost gets away with arresting and silencing them because, well, they have the power. It's only after a higher authority swoops in on a hunch that this wider issue is given any sort of peace, and it's obvious by the end of the investigation that this will happen again. Got all that? Remember, this is just the first assignment the class gets. Going all across the country gives it a real sense of place and helps to give wider context to whatever you're doing, but it also allows for greater dialogue regarding greater issues this fictional world faces. Cold Steel tackles themes of class warfare, corporate restructuring, cultural appropriation, religious legacy, internal company disputes, the glorification of war, the fragility of intercontinental relations, the ramifications of a nation declaring their independence, and more. And this is all framed in the context of Class 7, this wet behind the ears group of a very diverse class, seeing all this firsthand and coming to terms with the wider scope of the world and its problems that might sound simple at first but require very complex and difficult solutions, most of which come with some form of compromise. It always keeps its priorities in check by way of your classmates naturally bonding with each other over the long term, but Cold Steel's embrace of the scope of its world and the implications that brings is what really sets the world building apart. The only other game I can think of that balances personal character development with the wider socio-political issues of a fictional world is Dragon Age, but Dragon Age is all about choice, cause and effect, whereas there are many times Cold Steel emphasises that control of these situations lies beyond the students and what they can accomplish, however talented they may be. That all this commentary is viewed from the eyes of Class 7 helps a lot, because it demonstrates their growth over the long term. When faced with these wider problems, they recognise the injustice they see but buckle under the implied responsibility of facing it, because they're scared. Of course they are, but it's through seeing so much of the country and what each affiliate represents that they come to understand what to fight for on their own terms. And though each class member has a different background, they all come to realise the responsibility of helping others. And unlike a lot of other games, they don't always have to unpack their own baggage just to get to that point. Actually, something kinda understated about Cold Steel is the way the main character Reen is handled. It's pretty obvious early on that he's gonna have to be the one to solve everyone's problems, but he has a few personal issues of his own, mainly with what compelled him to enroll at Fours in the first place. And there are times where the other students help him with his history as an adopted son of a baron, as much as he helps them with their troubles. As corny as it sounds that Reen can judge everyone's personality by the way they might fight with a sword, it actually works because it gives us a glimpse into how he himself views things, and it's not just an easy out. There's actually one very pointed joke made where it's obvious the group assignments were made by the teacher to get Reen to sort out an argument between two classmates, and as annoyingly systematic as the game can get, it was cool to see them acknowledge the gaminess of the framework in a way that didn't cheapen the storytelling of the conflict therein. So yeah, I think it's really cool that this ages-long RPG has a lot to take in and talk about over the long term, and although none of the individual elements that fresh, they're combined and presented in a way that feels particular to Cold Steel. It's a solid story. Unfortunately, this definitely led to a few compromises in the actual game. The setup of having these kids go around and experience cultural osmosis by doing odd jobs for myriad towns and settlements might make for efficient storytelling, but actually doing these odd jobs tends to be a pain in the ass. Once again, most of your missions are fetch quests across the town or killing some monster out in the field, bookended by a trip into the area's big final dungeon. And, well, none of this is really all that compelling. Basic structure of the experience goes like this. Sunday is spent helping out the student council and trawling through the old schoolhouse. The following Wednesday is the practical exam and the field study directions, and the field study itself takes place over that weekend. The study involves a train ride to your destination, 2 or 3 loads of assigned chores, during which time some wider problem occurs peripheral to your field study that you have to solve anyway, and after some musing into the progression of the wider scale of events as the weeks pass, you do it all over again. Part of me wonders if this isn't all some subversive indictment of the value of schoolwork. As it turns out, framing all of your in-game tasks as schoolwork isn't the most engrossing setup for a game's tasks. Way too many missions feel menial, pointless, and boring, and so many times I'd complete a quest only to wonder why I bothered. I did every task assigned to me, even ones labelled optional, because I felt like I needed that assertion of my diligence. But much like real life, I really don't feel like I got anything out of all that extra credit. Was this meant to be intentional? Because if so, I'm gonna tell Falcon what I feel I have to tell so many experimental indie devs. You don't put the player unfriendly commentary in the game design itself. It just pisses people off. Okay, the real reason why you go on so many school trips is to see the world, and you really do need to see every location for itself to get that grasp on the socio-political themes that elevate the story. But it sort of works against itself when you realise that no matter how different the problems each region faces may be, the gameplay involved is the same between pretty much all of them. Something else that really wore on me in the long term is the storytelling. Now, don't take this as backpedaling. The characterization, the world building and the themes discussed were engrossing from beginning to end. But Cold Steel has a real problem with how it presents its A-plot, the actual ongoing conflict that propels the story. The villains do not really show themselves until chapter 3, when the shadowy terrorist group that's expediting the discord of the country behind the scenes is shown to the class, and it's not until chapter 4 that they're given a name and motive. Bear in mind there are, for all intents and purposes, 7 chapters. There are also just too many questions I have regarding the curriculum of the class. I get 4's is a military academy, but the class goes so far above and beyond the Call of Duty, I don't know why they aren't just given every commendation the school has. In chapter 3, I literally stopped a war just before it broke out, and I was only graded a B. Are you fucking serious? And the students are just left in the dark with regards to so much, even the nature of their own class and why it's so special, and this just gets really grating. Cold Steel spends so much energy on the mystery that the payoff is rarely worth it. There are many times where you'll get close to the answer before the game just hides it away from you again. Cold Steel really likes to play the long game. No, like the long game. I know that not only is there a Cold Steel 2 out in Japan and due for release here in a matter of months, but that there's a Cold Steel 3 in development. And it's obvious considering some of the points that are just not explained at all, most notably why Reen goes all Super Saiyan sometimes. Actually, he's hinted he has some beastly spirit inside him, which would put him closer to Naruto. To try and lighten this review up a bit, one observation I had was that some story points were just weird. Like, apparently it wasn't enough that Marquez have it in for the upper class and he be one of the more annoying characters. No, it turns out the reason he hates the nobility is because his sister was caught in a long, bloody marriage dispute that ended with her suicide. So he has an emotionally charged reason for engaging in a long-standing social issue. Was this necessary? The relatives of everyone in Class 7, except for Gaius, are either involved in the machinations of the country or the school, or they're dead. Old tropes die hard, I guess. Some influences also seem weird, like the big bad guy is obviously Darth Vader between the mask and the vocal distortion, but did they really have to rip off Berserk too? Okay, it's not quite Berserk, but the card game here is so bullshit it might as well be. Then Rei Ayanami shows up in a maid outfit out of fucking nowhere. There's an old guy named Gwyn, I'm pretty sure this line is a reference to the Wizard of Oz, and there's a character that uses dual swords and zip lines, and it turns out they belong to the Jaegers. You know, I'm making jokes just for the sake of a better video, but at some point I have to wonder if the devs are just taking the piss. So yeah, I was really divided the more I played Cold Steel. There's a lot going on under the surface in both game and story, but you really have to work for it. That's it, that the game felt like work much of the time is a really bad sign. The game was so repetitive and redundant, I was worried I wouldn't have enough varied material to write a review as long as it should be for a big ass JRPG. Remember when I mentioned the test? A simple test I have is if I have to turn on my iTunes and play random playlists just to keep trudging through a game. Well, not for a lack of trying, because the music is quite good, but yep, Cold Steel failed. A gripe I do have about the production values is the inconsistent voice acting. Some cutscenes are fully voice acted on every line, some are acted on every line except for Reen himself. Some jump back and forth between voice acting and silence. I get that this is one of those things that comes with the territory, but it took its toll here especially. You know, alongside an appearance by Ashley Birch. I'm honestly kind of amazed I stuck this game out. I mean, it gets the world building right. It gets it so right. There are some cutaways from what Class 7 is doing that show completely separate parties conversing, but what would be non sequiturs in weaker stories are slices of extra dimension to this complex world. And the character moments are done right. There are some great lines in this scene at the pool, but it gets the framing of the game so wrong. I know that games like these shouldn't always be played all at once, but the political intrigue is so intensive and so integral to the story that it does kind of demand that attention. This is one reason why you haven't caught that Dead Space video yet. And then I got to the ending. This section will contain spoilers, but honestly I think this is really worth discussing. not only because of the story beats themselves, but also because of how the way the final hours of the game were handled changed so many impressions of mine at the same time. There is a lot to discuss, and I'm frankly amazed I haven't seen more talk about it. But if you want to remain clean, you can skip to here. Well, the first thing you have to know is that there are several climaxes and epilogues. Remember that part in P4G where you catch the TV killer and then you play through 4 hours of social linking before hitting the last couple of bonus dungeons? The school festival here is basically that, giving you some last minute combat link upgrades before... Okay, so these kids investigate their one last loose end, not because it's the right thing to do, not because they want to prove what they've learned in the 6 months prior, but because they don't want the school to cancel the festival for the next day because they're putting on a concert. Wow, that's a motive. This is just schlock. All the political intrigue goes right out the window for supernatural bullshit that Emma, one of your classmates, is all too happy to keep hidden from you, even though it's obvious she's playing coy. I don't really care what she's hiding. That she's hiding anything after months of connection to our lead character undermines the whole social link aspect. Emma just doesn't realise that one student used to be a bloodthirsty mercenary. What embarrassing secret could she possibly have? So after beating this thing, we're rewarded with a statue that is obviously a mech. But I honestly doubted we get to see it in action before Cold Steel 2. I'm okay with last minute swerves, really, but this epilogue especially is so overlong that it can't possibly be worth
This evening, Guerrilla Fortress, which rests on the eastern border of the Empire, has been destroyed.
Oh. Alright, a little bit of context. A little earlier in the game, it was announced on the news that the region of Crossbell to the east verbally announced their independence, and no one in the Empire gave it any stock until they started freezing international assets, and so on. So although I didn't know if they really blew this hole in Guerrilla Fortress, when the Chancellor was going to give a national address the next day, sure enough,
war were declared.
Now, I'm not saying war is awesome, far from it, but I was really excited at where the story would go from here. It makes sense that the tension written into the story would build to something, and that you're not quite sure who is exactly responsible but you're going to war anyway, just adds so much more intrigue. Then there's this little addendum. I knew when this guy was shot down that he wasn't dead, but I figured with how much Cold Steel guards his secrets I wouldn't find out who was behind the mask until the sequel. I mean, he is the Darth Vader of the game. But you do find out who he is, and it's not even anyone's father, and I was blown away by the final reveal. So he brings in a whole legion of mechas to further disrupt proceedings in the Empire when they've just announced an intent of war, and it's like, shit, things are happening. And although the ending has gone on for longer than I imagined, there can't be much more game left, right? Well, the ILF come barreling down to force in an attempt to take all of the students prisoner, and the class has to try and fight them off, on foot. This goes about as well as you expect. Until... I do kind of lament Cold Steel just turns into a mecha anime right at the end, but the stakes are so involved, I can look past that. But then Darth Vader shows up in his mech and hands rain his ass, so he's forced to retreat, leaving his class to either die or become prisoners of war. Wow, they got me by the balls now, what's gonna happen next?
Well, that was anticlimactic.
Seriously, Reen and Valimar start running away, and then the game just stops. I especially love this card here that says, "The story will continue." Yeah, I bet it will, but that means that the story here isn't done, i.e. you couldn't tell a complete story within... Oh, how long was this game again? Yeah, I'm just gobsmacked really. With the way this iteration ends on a sour note with our heroes scattered and wounded and the bad guys having the definitive upper hand and the game just ending, it's like they tried to write an Empire Strikes Back ending and failed. And what makes me really worried is if they're just going to do these things all over again in Cold Steel 2. Now that we're entering a civil war, we are bound to have better gameplay than just doing school chores for tens of hours, but we very nearly didn't find out who the bad guy was, and we don't know exactly where this mech came from. And I don't know. I really want to believe that Cold Steel 2 will be even more gripping than the first, because holy shit, I have to know what happens next. But I really don't know if I can muster the strength and patience to put up with its esoteric bullshit all over again. Thankfully I have a good few months to think it over. In closing, see, I don't know, I don't know what to think about this game. It's making me question the value of any conclusion I can give, and I just don't know anymore. Cold Steel was an effective demonstration of the strengths of JRPGs, with its long-form storytelling being used to develop a rich setting with various unique issues, but it also showed why I don't play many of these. The game is just not as gripping over the 60 hours I spent on it as it thinks, and at some point both the devs and their fans have to stop and ask what the reasonable time limit for these things is. I stopped playing Eternal Sonata halfway through because of similar bullshit. I guess all I can really say is...
Gentlemen, we're done here. Take me to Cold Steel.
Oh, and as for the obligatory Danganronpa reference, didn't have to look very hard this time. The best sword in the game is called the Byakuya. I guess next time we'll see if the best sword in typo is called the Miyoda or something. Unless I get distracted by trying to get 909 up and running. I don't know. I don't fucking know. But it's not like I was disinterested either. No game with a reference to Oingo Boingo is gonna slip by me. At least I think the title was a shout out to Oingo Boingo. Usually I don't talk about them because, well, this is a video review, the footage itself suffices. Well, I'm wasting time. You're probably looking at this and going,
cool title, what the hell is this?
I mean, there's no way a developer just wouldn't explain the time travel elements at all, right? That'd be crazy. I'll stop.